Hello, my name is Ken Underwood. I'm here in Auburn, California at the Foothills Ceramic Art Museum. I'd like to take you on a tour and a little show of the display. So follow me. We're here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Auburn, and in the basement under the church. There are a series of 6 artist studios here, and we have painting, fiber, graphic arts, and even have a therapist who does art therapy. But I got one of the studios for my museum, and I named it Foothills Ceramic Art Museum, and I wanted to share my collection with the public. I've been collecting for about 40 years, and I filled up the house. I didn't have any more room. But I wanted to share it. People wanted to come by and see the collection. So by having a museum, I can bring out pieces and have a nice coherent show and talk to people, share my love of ceramic art. So come on in. Welcome. Today I want to talk about art, and clay in particular, and how it can capture the history and culture of many peoples and how those developed and shared over the years. For those who are in high school, you are learning now about world history and ancient civilizations. In America, ancient civilizations began with the first peoples, or the Native Americans. The descendants of the first peoples now live in the mountains and deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, and as far down as Chihuahua in Mexico. There were no borders then, so Mexico and Arizona and New Mexico all interacted and their lives intertwined. These people in the pottery world we refer to as Pueblo people, and they all have a lot of shared common interest and development in their pottery and in their styles. These pieces were made by the Acoma Nation, then the Navajo Nation, Jemez, the Hopi people, and Mata Ortiz, or the Paquime people. Notice the shapes of the pots. The broad bodies and the wide openings, well, that was for a function. These were used for cooking and for storage. And it was true across all of the Pueblo nations. You see that same shape used over and over again. Notice also the colors. They repeat as well. You see the black and white with the terracotta decoration, and that appears everywhere. But there's also some that are solid black and others like the Navajo that are brown. Again, the same kinds of materials, the same ideas shared amongst all the Pueblo people. One difference in their techniques is that the Acoma formed the pot and then put a white layer of clay over it called a slip. And that's how they get the very clear contrast in the colors. The Jemez people also put a slip on their pots, but it's more of a buff color, not the white. The Hopi and Mata Ortiz potters don't use any slip at all. They just paint directly on the base clay. The Navajo do something quite different. Their pieces are brown and not as decorated because they're covered with pine pitch. The pine pitch, when it's formed and fired, also not only gives it that brown color, but also makes the pots waterproof. So that's very useful and functional for them. Why did they use pine pitch? Well, they had pine trees. None of the others had the pine trees to even think of that idea. So based on where they lived and what materials were available to them, they adapted those for their own use. Another example of that adaptation is how did they paint? Well, the Acoma used yucca. They made brushes out of the fibers in the yucca cactus. That gave them those really fine lines from the yucca fibers. In Mata Ortiz, they used the fine hairs of their children to make brushes, and that gives them even finer lines. So you adapt whatever you can to do the work. The decorations that you see can be quite common across all the Pueblo potters. You can see mountains in these peaks. You can see water holes in the spirals. The parallel lines can be rain. Those same motifs show up in a lot of the different pots. Animals show up. You have feathers, you have snakes and lizards, fish, even rabbits are common to all of the different nations. Another trait that you see in the pots is to divide the decoration up into 4 pieces, quadrants. You'll see that in the Acoma pots, in the Hopi pots, in the Mata Ortiz. What that represents is very sacred and important to the Pueblo people, because those 4 quadrants relate to the 4 directions on the earth: north, south, east, and west. The people have sacred landmarks in each of those directions that they are related to their location. And so by putting the repeated pattern on a pot 4 times, it's reflecting that sacred nature of north, south, east, and west. The other aspect of that is in the harvesting and planting, the 4 seasons. The 4 directions and the 4 locations, the tracking of the sun, shows them when to plant and when to harvest. And all of those connections to nature are shown in the pots. By seeing all these common traits, we can intuit that the Pueblo people were not separate tribes. They were not separate nations to themselves. They interacted with each other, even though they were 700 miles apart and their civilizations were overlapping for thousands of years. They interacted with each other and they traded with each other. Not just goods and services, but ideas and philosophies. And those show up because there's so many similarities in their pottery. As I've said, these traditions go for thousands of years, but not all of the nations kept these traditions over the time. The Acoma have kept their traditions for over 1,000 years, but even they adopted what they have used from an earlier nation called the Mimbres. And so, again, this transition from one nation to another. The Hopi, on the other hand, have lost their traditions over the years. For a time, they lived with the Acoma, and at other times with the Zuni nation. And so during those overlap periods, they intertwined, they learned techniques, they copied what each other did. They informed each other. But then the Hopi moved on, and in the late 1800s, a very famous potter named Nampeo reinvented Hopi pottery altogether. And she started applying the decorating techniques of the Sitkaki people. And so their tradition is very new. The other example is the Paquime people. The Paquime ruins were abandoned 800 years ago and were not really rediscovered until 1960. At that time, a rancher in Mata Ortiz, which is nearby, just 5 miles away, discovered the shards of pottery in the ground around the Paquime ruins. And he said, gee, these are wonderful, I'd like to make those. So he spent years reinventing the process and learning how they did it with his local materials and copying the patterns that he saw on the ancient 800-year-old pots. So again, a total reinvention, but passed down over that long period of time to the current day. A really excellent example of how a nation has used its history and reflected it on its pottery is the Hopi people. They made a pattern that no other nation uses called the migration pattern. And what it reveals is that they were a nomadic people. And they would settle in one place, good years, then maybe a drought would hit, or maybe some dispute occurred. And then they would travel and migrate to another location and settle there. Over the years, who knows, decades, then they would move to another location. And in the pattern on the pot, that repeated pattern and migrating back and forth, repeats all the way around the pot. So it's a continuous pattern of nomadic activity, and they've captured their history in that pattern. What I think this shows is that even though the nations are different, separated by time and culture and distance, they are all historians, archaeologists, thinkers and learners, and they share their work. While many of these cultures overlapped and use common materials and ideas, they're also unique. They each have their own character. And I think that character is revealed in the way they make their pottery. The fine lines of the Acoma pottery, the fine lines and very thin walls of the Mata Ortiz pottery, I see in that scientists and problem solvers and engineers. They're really thinking through how to make something happen. When I look at the Navajo potters and the Hopi potters, there's a feature of their pottery called a fire cloud. And you can see that very clearly on the Navajo pottery. That's when, in firing in the pit, the flames and smoke of the fire actually touch the pots and then leave an impression, a dark spot. They call that a fire cloud. The Acoma and the Mata Ortiz don't like fire clouds. They think that that's imperfection. It causes the pot to be harmed, be destroyed. But the Navajo and the Hopi revere that. And I see in that a different philosophy. I see philosophers. I think of people who are holistic thinkers, and they really appreciate the imperfections of nature. So, what is your character? What is your family's history? What civilization have you descended from? Think about how you can capture your history in your art. Make some art. I'd like it to be pottery, but make some art that captures the copies, that elaborates on all of the symbols that you've seen in your life, that tell your history, that tell about your surroundings, your landscape, your philosophy, your character. Put those into your art, and you'll have something that you can pass down to your descendants and your generation. When you do that, I'd love to see your pottery. Bring it by the museum and show me. I'll share it. Also, I have a Pinterest page. You can post images there. And that way, your family, your friends and relatives can see it. And lots of people all around the internet will be able to share your history and your civilization. Thanks for making art and enjoying art. So long.